Hi, my name is Amy Regas. I'm a senior associate at Tetra Tech's Land Tenure and Property Rights team, and I have had the good fortune of traveling intermittently to Colombia for the past 5 years, working on land issues, and I am honored to have the opportunity to be here with you today to share a little bit of my knowledge about Colombia and land rights. Before I go into a more detailed discussion of land rights in Colombia, I wanted to give a general context about the country. I'll start with natural resources, which is extremely important. Colombia is the second most biodiverse country in the world. It has about 40% forest cover and holds 10% of the world's biodiversity. With respect to the population, there are an estimated a little bit over 46 million people in Colombia. 28% of the population is either Afro-Colombian, indigenous, or mixed Afro-Colombian and indigenous. And this is a very literate population with estimated literacy rate at 90%. With respect to the economy, the World Bank ranks Colombia as an upper middle income country. It's the region's third largest economy after Mexico and Brazil, and the country has experienced about 4.5% economic growth in recent years. However, about 1/3 of the Colombian population is considered poor and subside on less than $2 a day. When we talk about the economy in Colombia, we need to think about cocaine because it is a big part of the economy. Colombia is now the second largest producer of cocaine in the world, and that's an improvement. For many years, it was the primary producer. And we also need to think about how the earnings from cocaine fuel conflict. Hundreds of millions of dollars that are made by cocaine sales go to illegally armed groups. Land ownership in Colombia is highly unequal. About 1.2% of the population is estimated to control more than 50% of the land. And if we look at the country's Gini coefficient, it is one of the top 20 most unequal countries in the world. For decades, Colombia has been involved in a protracted civil conflict between the government of Colombia, left-wing insurgent groups, paramilitary groups, and drug cartels that have aligned with some of the other illegally armed groups. And as a result, millions of Colombians have been displaced. And this is a topic that we'll come back to again and again as we move on. As we assess land tenure constraints or consider any types of land tenure and property rights interventions, it is of critical importance to consider gender and the needs of vulnerable populations right from the onset. And so I wanted to make this one of my very first slides, a slide that specifically talks about women, Afro-Colombians, indigenous groups, and land rights in Colombia. In Colombia, Afro-Colombians and indigenous groups are among the most marginalized and poorest members of Colombian society. With respect to land rights, indigenous peoples, who are estimated at 1 to 3% of the population, have title to approximately 1/3 of Colombian territory, which is a very large amount. However, only 8% of reserve land, or resguardo land, as it's called in Colombia, is suitable for agriculture. Afro-Colombians own approximately 5 million hectares of collective territories in Colombia. And regarding women, Colombian legislation protects women's land rights, yet in practice those rights are very often violated. Lacking resilience to violence and land grabbing, Afro-Colombians, women, and indigenous peoples have been displaced at disproportionately high rates. Afro-Colombians are estimated to represent approximately 25% of the Colombian population, yet they represent 35% of those who have been displaced by the internal conflict. So why is USAID concerned with land rights in Colombia? USAID's Land and Conflict Toolkit states that people have fought over land since the beginning of recorded history, and Colombia is no exception. That same toolkit also states that the likelihood of violent conflict increases substantially when gross inequities characterize landholding patterns. And you might remember my first slide where I talked about how unequal land distribution is in Colombia. So land issues are considered a root cause of Colombia's protracted civil conflict, and they are one of the main agenda items being discussed at the negotiation tables for the peace negotiations currently taking place between the FARC and the government of Colombia in Havana, Cuba. As a result of the protracted civil conflict, Colombia has millions of displaced persons, and there is a current focus on securing land rights as one means of preventing further displacement. Plus, there is a lot of international pressure on Colombia to resolve one of the largest IDP crises in the world. In addition, USAID is seeking to secure land rights in order to improve conditions for sustainable economic growth, to protect biodiversity, and to support ethnic groups who have been displaced disproportionately by the conflict. According to Colombia's 2014-2018 Country Development Strategy, USAID's overall mission in Colombia is Colombia more capable of successfully implementing a sustainable and inclusive peace. Land issues are a very important part of that. Now I'd like to give you a little bit of a snapshot of the overall property rights system in Colombia. Colombia is plagued by many of the same issues we commonly see across developing countries around the world. Transaction costs for land formalization are very high in terms of time and money. The formalization procedures themselves are cumbersome and not necessarily easy to understand for the average citizen. The institutions involved are often weak, their resources are constrained, and some of them do suffer from corruption. The judicial system is backlogged, and it can take many years to resolve a land conflict in the court system. There is a lack of accurate, complete data on land ownership. The cadasters are not updated, and there is lack of information on boundaries and on use. And overall, the panorama of government entities involved in land issues is extremely complicated. The government of Colombia has set a 10-year target to restitute 270,000 families and to give title to 500,000 families, rural families, covering 4 million hectares. Accomplishing these goals of formalization and restitution is going to be a very large challenge considering the property rights environment that I just described. Land in the Colombian economy. There is a very high land concentration in Colombia. According to Oxfam, 14% of landowners in the country own 80% of the land. Land is not necessarily distributed to the most productive users, and land values have suffered in areas of conflict when residents have been forced to flee their properties or been forced to sell at well below market rates. Some portions of Colombia remain completely outside of the government's control. That has been improving over recent years, but it's still a situation that needs to be dealt with. There has occurred purposeful seizure of some of the country's prime arable land for economic purposes. A December 31st, 2014 Washington Post article about the palm industry reported that the palm industry's rapid expansion is yielding new evidence of a boon that benefited from the displacement of small farmers, indigenous groups, and others by armed conflict. In addition, without accurate valuation and a functioning tax collection system, municipal capacity to provide services is hampered, as is confidence of the citizens in the government structure. With respect to the extractive industry, a threefold increase in global gold prices over the past 10 years has fueled a gold boom in Colombia. Much of that gold rush is illegal or informal gold mining, and therefore does not easily provide the benefits it should to local Colombian communities. I'm going to take a couple of extra minutes to talk about Colombia and the land conflict, since this is at the heart of USAID's interests in Colombia right now. Going back a little bit in history, Colombia, in common with many Latin American nations, evolved as a highly segregated society, split between wealthy families descended from Spanish ancestors, and then the vast majority of poor Colombians. In this environment, two primary insurgent groups emerged: the FARC, which is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and the ELN, the National Liberation Army. Then violence continued to spread as paramilitary groups armed in order to fight these left-wing insurgent groups, and then drug cartels entered the equation and aligned themselves with various armed parties. As a result, there have been decades of widespread civil conflict, and Colombian citizens have been caught in the middle. According to a report by Colombia's National Center for Historic Memory, approximately 220,000 people have died in this conflict. And according to the BBC, 80% of those were Colombian citizens. Today, the FARC, which is the largest rebel group in Colombia, is sitting in Havana with the Colombian government negotiating peace accords. After 6 months of negotiations, they reached agreement on land reform, one of 6 main topics of discussion. The agreement calls for provision of land to poor farmers, along with land titling and the provision of other needed services in rural areas. So at the macro level, Colombia's 50-year civil conflict is partially rooted in land issues. According to one study that was conducted, between the early 1980s and 2000, about half of Colombia's most fertile land was actually acquired by armed groups. I had mentioned displacement previously, and estimates that are up to 5 million Colombians have been displaced by this conflict. A lack of secure land tenure is considered one of the factors that facilitated such widespread displacement, and it's one of the reasons that there's so much emphasis right now on land titling and on securing land tenure. And as the government addresses this internal displacement, which is partially through implementation of the 2011 Victims Law, they face some serious challenges. Those challenges range from violence against restitution leaders to the complicated issue of secondary occupants, to the weakness of some of the institutions that have the responsibility for restituting land. As we discuss land and conflict in Colombia, we also have to keep in mind that there is a weak ability of the judicial system to resolve conflicts in the court system, and there is also a scarcity of effective alternate dispute resolution mechanisms. Colombia's biodiversity and its richness of natural resources are an extremely important characteristic of the country, and Colombia is currently facing a number of threats to those resources. For one, due to lack of access to land, poor farmers and poor Colombians seeking land have pushed into forests and biodiverse areas. In addition, Colombia has seen extensive forest clearing for cocoa production, for palm plantations, and for the extractive industries, among other motives. Insecure tenure does not usually provide very strong incentives for people to use sustainable practices. And unfortunately, in a good portion of rural Colombia, land is not titled and security of tenure is not strong. Indigenous and Afro-Colombian groups have been forcibly removed from their land by conflict actors or for economic purposes. As a result, these groups with strong historical and cultural ties to the land have been replaced by others who may be more likely to exploit it unsustainably. There is weak capacity and lack of reliable data to protect parks and other reserves. The government authorities often do not have information regarding who is living inside the boundaries of parks and reserves, whether those people are there legally or not, and they don't have many of the tools needed to protect the parks from the invasions. As I mentioned earlier, a gold boom in Colombia has fueled gold mining, and this has been detrimental to the environment through forest clearing and through mercury contamination. So what is USAID doing to address these land-related challenges in Colombia? USAID has a number of past, current, and future projects which have components that address many of the land issues that I talked about today. Some examples of those projects include the Adam and Midas projects, which conducted land formalization pilots and supported improvements to the policy framework for land and restitution in Colombia. The Colombia Public Policy Program, which also worked at the high-level policy arena. The Cieli Central, Cieli North-South, and Colombia Responde programs are all working on formalization and land restitution in different geographic regions of Colombia. There's the Colombia Access to Justice Project, working with the court system and the judges. And there's the Colombia Afro-Colombian and Indigenous Program, or ACIP, which specifically works on land issues tied to Colombia's ethnic minorities. The Colombia Land and Rural Development Project focuses on capacity building of the Colombian institutions that are charged with restitution, formalization, and rural development. And the upcoming Colombia Artisanal Gold Mining Environmental Impact Reduction will tackle some of the negative environmental impacts from gold mining in Colombia. These projects are strengthening Government of Colombia institutions. They're raising women and vulnerable populations' awareness about their land rights. They're carrying out land titling and registration. They're improving land information systems and updating cadastral data. They're working on restitution and providing other types of support to victims. They are improving the legal framework. They are formalizing informal mining operations. And all of these projects are standing by, ready to support peace agreement implementation if the peace accords in Havana are successful. Thank you for your time.